in explanations of Rwanda's genocide, and genocides more generally, one common idea is that extremist or exclusionary ideologies, which express themselves as racism, long-standing hatreds, ethnic prejudices, that these ideologies were important drivers of the violence. So I think it's very tempting to make such claims, but I would invite us to rethink their precise causal role in the genocide. So my argument here on the role of ideology is made in three stages, or 3 points. So first, there was not one single ideology that existed in Rwanda before the genocide. Rwanda's public sphere was ideologically plural. So this is an important point, as it's all too easy to observe an extremist ideology after the violence, ex post, and to assume its causal role before the violence, ex ante. But if we do this, we miss the fundamentally important observation that there were multiple ideologies in circulation before the violence that competed for Rwandans' attention. Let me briefly describe 3 such ideologies. So the first would be the ideology of Gregoire Kayibanda, the president during Rwanda's first republic, immediately after the Hutu revolution and independence of the country in 1962. So Kayibanda promoted the idea that Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa were biologically distinct races. He saw power in ethnic terms, that he believed the Hutu had been oppressed by the Tutsi in a feudal system that the revolution which he spearheaded, had overturned. He equated democracy with Hutu majority rule, and his ideas would have resonated with Rwandans who were 45 years old and older, individuals who would have had direct memory of the revolution and who were politically conscious at that time. So this would describe, in fact, much of Rwanda's ruling elite at the time of the genocide. So then there's also the ideology of Juvenal Habyarimana, president of Rwanda's second republic from 1973. So he had a different idea about ethnicity. He saw Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa as distinct ethnic groups, but he was careful to distinguish between the Tutsi elite, who were part of the feudal monarchy, and the ordinary Tutsi, who did not participate in the political power that oppressed the Hutu. And this distinction was important, as Habyarimana's message was one of inclusion and national unity. He believed that Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa should work together to achieve the development of the country. So Habyarimana's ideas would have resonated with the generation after Kayibanda's, so mostly Rwandans between 30 and 45 years old. And finally, I would mention the religious ideology of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church was a major social force in Rwanda, with the majority of Rwandans adhering or claiming to be practitioners or believers. However, the Catholic Church's ideology, at least in Rwanda, was more ambiguous. On the one hand, it espoused the classic Christian ideals of compassion, love, fellowship, tolerance, and Christian solidarity. On the other hand, historically, the Catholic Church had played ethnic favorites. First, it had favored the Tutsi, and then it had switched its support to the Hutu. And the Catholic Church's leadership also had strong ties with the ruling parties in both the First and Second Republics. It was close to state power. So this meant that it did not issue unequivocal condemnations of ethnically targeted violence that occurred prior to the genocide. Anyway, my point is that there were at least 3 ideologies that circulated and competed in Rwanda's public sphere before the genocide. Okay, so this brings me to the second point in my argument, which is that the extremist ideology that did exist, as one of several, was not even the dominant ideology in Rwanda at the outset. More moderate ideologies were stronger, were in an ascendant position in the years immediately prior to the genocide. So when President Habyarimana bowed to the international and domestic pressure to open up Rwanda politically in 1991, so to liberalize and to make the country more democratic, one of the immediate effects of this liberalization was the pluralization of Rwanda's political landscape. So Rwanda went from having one political party, the ruling MRND, to having 16 parties. And it went from having just 3 newspapers to having 80 print publications. And tellingly, only one of these 16 parties and only 14 of the 80 new print publications had explicitly ethnic orientations at the beginning. So my point is that ethnic extremism was a fringe ideology with minority support at the beginning, that is in the early years from 1990 to 1991. The evidence for extremism being a minority perspective is quite strong. The 3 largest opposition political parties, the MDR, the PSD, and the PL, all had made cross-ethnic appeals initially that emphasized national unity, and all counted Hutu and Tutsi among their supporters at the beginning. They issued press releases which unequivocally condemned ethnically targeted violence, and the MDR, the largest opposition party, had made the elimination of racial discrimination a pillar of its party manifesto, and had written explicitly into its party statutes as an objective the peaceful coexistence between ethnic groups. In the media, a moderate director was put in charge of the national Radio Rwanda, and he implemented a strict editorial policy that, for example, prohibited the use of ethnically inflected terms such as inyenzi, which literally meant cockroaches, used to describe the mainly Tutsi rebels. So in short, at the beginning, moderate ideas resonated more with Rwandans than extremist ones. And this brings me to my third and final point about ideology. Eventually, ethnic extremism would eclipse and prevail moderation, over moderation. It moved from the background to the foreground of Rwandan politics and society. In other words, Rwandan's public sphere radicalized. And it radicalized because of the unusual coincidence of 2 forces, the civil war and the move to democratize. So the war represented a security threat, an existential threat to the physical safety of ordinary Rwandans who genuinely feared for their lives. And the liberalization, the political liberalization, represented a political threat to the ruling elite as the opposition demanded a greater share of power. So the war and the liberalization interacted and escalated the threat. And as the threat intensified, politics radicalized. Eventually, by late 1993, the main political parties in Rwanda had each fractured into moderate and extremist factions. The extremist wings embraced the ideology of Hutu power, the idea that political power belonged to the Hutu as the natural numerical majority. They wished to preserve the gains made by the Hutu revolution that had ushered in Rwandans' independence and that had reversed the socio-political order in which a Tutsi elite had once upon a time governed. So, in sum, there were multiple ideologies in Rwanda. Extremism was not the dominant ideology initially. However, the threat created by war and liberalization weakened the moderate position, and Rwandan politics radicalized. So in conclusion, an exclusionary ideology, racism, ethnic hatred, tribal antipathy, however you wish to describe it, represented a necessary condition for the genocide, but it was not a sufficient one. Any explanation that emphasizes the causal role of an extremist ideology in the genocide must explain why the extremist ideology came to prevail over the other non-extremist, moderate ideologies that also existed. And I consider this question in the book, and the issue of extremist moderate contestation is the subject of another video.